World building. It's something I talk about a lot. In fact, almost every episode of my podcast has at least some bits of it dedicated to talking about world building with other people, because I think world building is a big part of Dungeons and Dragons. It's a big part of the DM's job. Even when you're running a module, you still need to communicate the world to your players, even if it's not your own world. World building is going to be part of your life as a dungeon master, whether you homebrew your own worlds or just use modules. So I think world building is one of the most important skills to learn. However, I do see a lot of mistakes made when world building, and that's not a bad thing. World building is hard. A lot of professional authors don't do it very well. A lot of the most famous series of all time have very janky world building at times. It happens. So let's sort out some of the most important mistakes for dungeon masters specifically. Without further ado, let's get started. Now, let's start with things that people think are mistakes that I don't really think are mistakes for dungeon masters. Number 1, having a derivative world, I don't think is a huge problem. Now, I don't think your world should be a direct ripoff. Don't directly reference events, and try not to take names from other things, even though, for me at least, that's really difficult to do, because if I see a cool name in media, I'll probably steal it. But try not to be directly derivative, but at the same time, if you want to take inspiration, I find no issue with that. I don't think that taking inspiration is a big deal. If you're just using a dark fantasy inspired by Game of Thrones, that doesn't mean you're ripping off Game of Thrones. If you have a large, overwhelming army led by a Dark Lord, that doesn't mean you're ripping off Lord of the Rings. It just means that you might be taking inspiration from Lord of the Rings. The other mistake I've talked about before, but you don't need to flesh out your entire world. A lot of people will say that you need to have fleshed out world elements and dynamics between factions and all this in order to have a D&D world, and I think that that's stupid because, quite frankly, most of the time your players are not going to be encountering those things. If you develop elements to your world in a distant land that your players are probably never going to visit, you're just wasting your time. Focus on where your players are. Your players are the focus. Build the world around them. Of course, create elements elsewhere if you find the inspiration and the time, but your focus should be the immediate vicinity around your players and the plot. So those are two things that I don't really think are mistakes, that some people kind of do think are mistakes. Let's move on to actual mistakes that I see a lot of world builders make. And for starters, people building a world without any sort of direction or intent. Now, this one I see a lot in Dungeons & Dragons, and it's a really easy one to fix. What I mean by without direction and without intent is basically you're creating a world with a bunch of splattered elements that you think should be included, but you don't really know how to include them. You're including new governments and new religions and new organizations, new monsters, new factions, new races, but there's not really a purpose to them. They're not created with any specific intent in the plot. Now, I do think some superfluous elements can be included. Like, for example, my homebrew world has 2 moons. There's not really a purpose to that. My homebrew world has 2 moons. Maybe I'll use that in the future, but it's just a meaningless detail that I included. 2 moons. Cool, that's it. There's no purpose to that. But if you're constantly doing that for every part of your world, and you're using up your time to create these superfluous governments, factions, etc., you're just wasting precious time when you do that. Remember, D&D has a bit of a time investment and a time limit. A DM needs to get the content for a session done before the session. So if you're wasting time creating superfluous elements that you don't need, again, it's just a waste. This does fall into that misconception of world building where you need to create all of these different elements even if they don't really have a purpose. Don't create superfluous elements without intent. Create things with a purpose in the campaign. Like, for example, for my homebrew campaign, I created a whole new race. I created a homebrew race. Number 1, I thought it would be fun. And number 2, they served as both antagonists at the beginning of the campaign and also allies at the end of the campaign. They were a dynamic part of the world that allied with the party over the course of time. Their leader, the sovereign, became an important NPC. They had stake in the plot. They had meaning. I had intent when I made them. I didn't just throw them in there for no reason. And yeah, I set out to create the Von Wheel in the first place, not really for plot intent, but because I thought a homebrew race would be cool. I came up with the intent later. I actually think that that's fine. You can start out by just creating a new subclass. I just did that. I created a whole new Gunslinger Warlock subclass. Why did I do this? Well, I was playing Red Dead Redemption and I had the inspiration and I wanted to make a subclass, so I made it. I came up with the reason later on, the plot reason, the stake that these gunslinging warlocks would have in the plot. That came later. Intent doesn't have to exist before you create something, but make sure to have intent in the back of your mind while you're making a thing. If you don't think that this will factor in ever at all, maybe just put the idea on the back burner and hold off on fleshing it out until you figure out a proper reason to fully develop this new idea in your head. Just because an idea isn't developed doesn't mean it's gone or it's vanished or it has no more relevance or bearing. You can still use ideas later on. Another common mistake for both DMs and writers, quite frankly, is world building without idea or without detail. Now, idea is essentially the focus of the world. It's whatever your story is trying to revolve around. Like, for example, the world of Panem in the Hunger Games essentially revolves around the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games are the central, most important thing that happens in Panem. The whole world and the systems of the world basically revolve around the Hunger Games. The 12 districts are so that we can have a split in the competitors during the Hunger Games. The whole dystopian future is to establish the setting for the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games are the central focus of Panem. Meanwhile, detail gives context to the world that you have created. It's minor things that make the world make sense. Overall, for Dungeons & Dragons especially, I think that idea is way more important. Panem lacks a lot of details. It has the central idea of the Hunger Games, but a lot of the details needed to make the world make sense aren't really there. Like, how does the capital sustain itself, and how does it prevent rebellion from districts, especially since the districts are the ones that provide them their food and their military might? How has the military district not overthrown the capital yet? What does Panem contribute politically and financially? It is really nonsensical sometimes when you think about it, but the Hunger Games is far from a god-awful example of world building. Yes, it does lack some details, but the central idea is there, and since it revolves around that central idea very well, and the storytelling itself is very, very good, the Hunger Games, at least the books from what I've read, holds up. That's not to say detail isn't important. Tolkien thrived on very important details that made his world make sense. There's a reason why Tolkien is regarded as the greatest world builder of all time, or one of the greatest world builders of all time, because he thrived on that detail, and the details were important. He also had a central focus for his world. The adventure, the One Ring. It had that focus, and therefore Tolkien was able to build these details around it and build up a really cool world for both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. You do not need to have the detail of Tolkien. You just need the idea first. Build up that detail later, especially for a D&D game. Like I said, you only have so much time, and you should be focusing your time around that central idea. Important details can come later. Okay, so finally, world building without connection. This is part of that details thing that I talked about just earlier. When you world build, you need to connect elements of your world. There's a reason why the MCU feels so cool to watch, because a lot of the elements of the MCU connect together, and that is really, really satisfying to see. And it doesn't just apply to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it applies to any large world. Now, you don't need to go that crazy with it. The MCU has been going on for years and years and years, and there's a reason they can build up all those connections. But even just minor little things can make your party really, really happy. When they make those connections, it makes them feel really, really smart, and therefore it engages them more in your world. Making connections between guilds and between governments and kingdoms, it also just adds to the dynamic, almost realism of your fantasy world. Now, I use realism really loosely because realism isn't really what we're going for here. It's Dungeons and Dragons. But at the same time, making your world more believable by building connections, it is good and healthy for whatever homebrew you're trying to build up. A common mistake I see is building up all these elements, even if you build them around your plot, and not connecting them, not making them a fluid part of the story and of the world as a whole. It's a common mistake, but it's a big one, and something that more people need to do. Matt Mercer does this really, really well. A lot of elements of his world connect together and form this very fluid, very believable universe for Exandria. I think that's part of the reason why his world building works so well in that show. Alright, that's all the points, but always remember that while I'm talking about this is stuff that should come after making the game fun. If you think that these world building elements can make your game more enjoyable for your players, include them. But if you don't think that it will make the game more fun, if you think it will bog it down, don't include them. But for the people who want to world build, try to use these tips to world build just a little bit better. Alright, if you guys enjoyed this episode of Tabletop Tavern Tips, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more videos by me, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern. I have a super special episode of RPG horror stories coming out on Friday or Saturday, depending on how fast I edit, to celebrate 50 episodes of RPG horror stories. So I'm really excited for that. Finally, if you want to leave your own thoughts or tips, go down to the comments down below. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.